can never just die quietly. You're actually perpetuating it. She didn't say it as eloquently as that, but by you bringing these things up, you're actually perpetuating continued racism. And the common theme of criticism that we've gotten the last month, especially, has been very similar to that. Things are fine. Things have gotten so much better. Why do you have to keep talking about this? Why are you bringing all of this back up? Why, Ralph, in your mind, is it important to examine our past as we're thinking about sort of where we are today and where we need to head moving forward?
I can say it in one word. It's clarity. It's so that we can look at things a lot more clearly. I have gotten that same email. I've gotten that same letter where, why do you keep bringing all this stuff back up? And I think there is a sense among a lot of white Southerners and white Northerners too, for that matter, that we've done this. It's all finished. We've had a Black president. We've checked the boxes, but we have to keep doing the work, and the work is continuing to talk about it. I don't think that our political class in this state talks about it nearly enough. It's at the core of so much of what is. It's not only at the core of the way that we think of ourselves as a state, it affects our public policy. And if you understand the past, and you understand our political past and how the environment that created those politics, you see how that in turn affects public policy. And you might begin to think about other public policy solutions in a different way, such as healthcare, education. Those are the two big ones that I wish we would think, but we refuse to think about it with respect to race because we're saying, well, you're just playing the victim. I've heard that a lot. You still see yourself as a victim. I don't see myself as a victim, but I don't want you to think about my Blackness as being invisible. And that is what I so often take issue with, is that everyone says, well, I don't see color. I said, yes, you do. Everybody sees it. And it's what you do with it that's important. And I think understanding that past makes us do very different things with what it is that are perceptible differences.
Sure. Policy, that's sort of our forte at Mississippi Today. We have a newsroom of reporters covering any number of policy issues. And it's hard to cover policy without covering the nitty-gritty of politics. The elected officials who ultimately get to decide that policy. I think, we believe holding them accountable during election season and once they're elected and serving in office is sort of this sort of hallmark of making progress for this state, I think. But, talking back again about some political stuff, thinking back to the tweet that I read of yours from election night in 2016 about Donald Trump. 4 years later, here we are again. Trump's running for re-election, and race is, I think it's at the heart of this election. You could make the argument that perhaps the pandemic is, but the deaths, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, others, we could talk about sort of the social change and policy change that has come because of the protests that you mentioned a minute ago. But this election is here. We're 2 weeks today away from it. And it's hard for me to think about America as not being more Mississippi than ever. Sort of alluding back to your tweet from 4 years ago. Do you agree with that? I mean, we can talk about wanting to understand each other and wanting progress in that regard, but I'm not sure we're there. I'm actually very sure that we're not there.
I'm very sure that we're not there. as well. And I'm just going to echo something that that John Cobb said last night that really stuck with me. And we don't have to go very far back to make these connections. And he was speaking about the shooting in Charleston. And one of the things that the young man who shot those people up in Charleston said that the reason he shot him was that because you're raping our women and you're taking over to the black man. So and shoots him right there. It's only weeks later that Donald Trump descends the escalator in Trump Tower and says, we're bringing a rapist here. So it's where's all of this stuff coming from? And I think over the last 4 years, I think we're seeing it a lot more. Some of that has to do with the way that our media landscape works, where we are attracted to the shiny objects. And so often that brings attention, but what I'm concerned about is how much has been under the surface for a long time. Charlottesville really brought that home for me, having spent time at the University of Virginia. And that's another place that really hasn't confronted its whole past very well. They dealt with the legacy of Jefferson as if it's foundational, and not realizing, Jefferson's a pretty malleable historical figure. We can take his words and twist them any way we want to. And people at UVA talk about Thomas Jefferson like he's just gone out for a pack of cigarettes at the party. He's coming right back. But we don't talk about that legacy and what that meaning of that legacy of the past is in the present. And that's what we've got to really confront, rather than trying to come up with an idea of America that never really existed. So, we were talking, Baldwin's debate with William F. Buckley was, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? And Baldwin was saying, yes, of course it is. But largely what he was saying is this idea of the American dream is not real. It's a lie. And we have to confront the ways we have been lying to ourselves in this country for a very long time. And until we do that, we're going to be confronting this. And it's why I keep bringing all this stuff up, because if we don't stop lying to ourselves, when we stop lying to ourselves, maybe I'll stop.
Sure.
But we haven't stopped lying to ourselves.
I'm thinking about an essay of yours that I remember reading. I guess it was back in the summer, June or July. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I should have written this down in my notes for Vanity Fair. About you sort of drew some parallels between, these deaths that have inspired this moment of protest, what some call a social revolution happening in 2020, with the lynching of Emmett Till. I guess that's what you're getting at here. You have to keep thinking about what happens in the past in order to better understand where we are.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why Mamie Till opened that casket. Mamie Till opened that casket. That's a decision that is really reverberated into the present. And I think the way that I said that this is the prehistory of the Black Lives Matter movement. If you look at Emmett Till, and you look at the decisions that were made from an activist standpoint, from Mamie Till Mobley's point of view. And I see so much of that being taken up, that mantle being taken up by Black Lives Matter protesters. I think just the protests that took place in Jackson this past summer.
Yeah.
That's the largest civil rights protest since, was it 64?
Yep.
That's really significant. And that is why, that's one of the reasons we have a new state flag. So when people say to me, well, Mississippi will never change, we can't change certain things in Mississippi, I always point to that. That's That's a moment. We did change a lot in the 60s, but I think we've also, over the last 50 years, perhaps become a little complacent. And I think the illusion, that post-racial illusion that a lot of people bought into. I asked my students about that. I said, I'm looking out at you today. You are all children. You're children of Obama. You were promised this post-racial society, and you didn't get it. And one of my students says, that's it exactly. I thought I was getting that, and now I know I'm not. Where is that?
Yeah.
Again, it's the lie.
I think, particularly for white people, and I'll speak authoritatively here for white Mississippians, because that's who I cover. I think it's really easy to suppress a lot of our history because it's tough to think about. It's tough to talk about, certainly. Why do you think we do that so often? Why are our schools not teaching the history? Why? I mean, I'm fully bought in myself to what you're saying here. We have to examine the past in order to have a better future, and present and future. But why don't we do that? Why is it easy to sweep that stuff under the rug? And why is it so ingrained in our government and in our education system, you name it?
Because they're hard conversations. As I said in the essay this morning, Mississippi's past is not a fun place to visit. It's like, you don't want to go there. It's painful. Kind of my students kind of getting into the mind of that character that Eudora Welty develops for Where's the Voice Coming From. They did not want to get in that man's head. It's a really uncomfortable place to be. And I think that's really what it is. It's an uncomfortable place to be. But what I would argue is going to those uncomfortable places is where we have to go in order to move forward. We can't go with this American dream, this lie. And I know that some of my conservative listeners are going to say, well, he doesn't believe in the American dream. Well, no, I really don't. I live out a lot of the American dream myself. I have a very good life. I'm a professor at a university. I write for a living. That's a great dream. But the reason I've chosen to write about what I've chosen to write about is I feel this need to, as I said, be this clarifying force, to be one of them. And I think that's what every Mississippi writer shares with me. We are trying to both understand and explain this place so that others will understand it as well. So that if we all, kind of read this common literature that's ours, it comes out of this place, that's part of our shared history. And if we can come to embrace that, then we can maybe begin to think clear about the past, but we've got to have the difficult discussions. We just can't. It can't be happy talk.
Sure. Well, that's a perfect segue into the next part of our conversation. I want to talk about some straight up politics here. And normally when I talk politics with you, Ralph, we have a drink in our hands, and perhaps maybe next time when the pandemic slows down, we can make that happen. But I actually, before I get into this next question, though, I do want to say, I forgot to say this at the top. Ralph is gonna take some questions from anyone in attendance. So on the Zoom chat, I guess it is, if you're in the Zoom with us, just leave us a question there, and we'll leave 15-20 minutes at the end of this talk to take those questions. But Ralph, again, sort of thinking about this conversation that we've already had in the last half hour or so about race in Mississippi. We have a huge Senate race, U.S. Senate race this fall in 2 weeks. Of course, Republican incumbent Cindy Hyde-Smith, who was appointed in 2018 and is running now for a full 6-year term, and Democrat Mike Espy. on paper, Ralph, this should be a very compelling race for many reasons. You know, a black man, Mike Espy, who has broken many political barriers, racial barriers in his long political career already, running against a white woman who, um, uh, I have to like think about how I say this. I mean, she makes gaffes regularly when she talks about race in Mississippi. That's the kindest I could put it. There's not a whole lot of national media attention yet. I mean, it's kind of trickled in a little bit here and there, but big focus has been on other states, some other southern states like South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, but not really Mississippi.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this morning on the Daily, they're talking about North Carolina. It's like, why aren't you talking about Mississippi?
Yeah, you know, highest percentage of black voters of any state in the country is in Mississippi. On paper, as I just mentioned, we've got these compelling storylines, but not a whole lot of attention. Why do you think that is?
Well, partly because Cindy Hyde-Smith's been in the witness protection program most of the time. She hasn't been here, and I think that's part of the strategy. I mean, in thinking about SB, I think that in Mississippi we could elect a black senator this time, and I think if Mississippians would think strategically, I don't think we're going to have a majority. I think the majority in the Senate after this election is going to be Democratic. I think it would be a much better thing for Mississippi, for your Republican listeners to think a vote for Espy gets Mississippi a place in the majority. That could be, if anybody's having any doubts right now, that would be what I would say. That would give you that's a reason to vote for Espy. The second reason is we should not be represented by someone. The state should not be represented by someone like Cindy Hyde-Smith, who talks about how beautiful the displays are at Beauvoir, talks about being on the front row of a lynching, or a public hanging, I should say it, but it's a lynching. That's an embarrassment. It falls into every stereotype people have about Mississippi. By electing Espy, we could go a long way toward changing that. I really do think that would. I mean, if people who haven't made up their minds, think about it. Mississippi could be part of the Democratic majority in the Senate if we elected Espy.
You mentioned earlier that you don't think our elected officials or candidates perhaps talk enough about race. Espy has, as we've reported this year, has centered race as his sort of hallmark campaign message. It's easy for him to do that, of course. His family history, his political upbringing. Like I said, he's broken a lot of racial barriers as a politician in the past. He was first black congressman in Mississippi post Reconstruction. Cindy Hyde-Smith, as you said, you so eloquently put, she's in the witness protection program. We've reported that she has run a very low-key campaign. She's not campaigning nearly as much as she was 2 years ago in the special election. She, in the few public sort of appearances that she has made, she's kept them short. She hasn't delved into a lot of specific policy issues or a lot of topical social issues like race in Mississippi. Should she be talking more about it? It seems like kind of a dumb question to ask you, but I think
yes,
it's important.
She should be, but I think the reason that she's not is because she doesn't know how to. And I think that's one of the reasons she's not talking, is she doesn't know how to. And if she does, it would sink her campaign. Let's face it, Adam. The only reason that a lot of people are voting for Cindy Hyde-Smith is because she's white and she has an R after her name. That's it. And we in the state really have to move beyond that. and seeing, as I said, thinking strategically, this could give us a place, Mississippi, a seat in the majority that's going to be in the Senate.
Yeah.
That's even more important. And what's even more important than that, as I said earlier, is having someone with real gravitas, which we do not have right now.
For SB to win, as we've reported, he needs to convince a lot of what I would call white moderate voters. These are voters who perhaps are traditional Republican voters, maybe even voted for Trump in 2016, but perhaps have grown frustrated or embarrassed by some of what he's championed the past 4 years. Cindy Hyde-Smith, as you mentioned, as everyone knows, she has sort of hitched her wagon to Trump. Trump, I think, won with 50, I should have written this in my notes too, 57, 58% of the vote in 2016 in Mississippi, which is, fairly substantial margin, one of his best margins of victory of any state in the country. But there's this sense among, SB, SB voters and SB himself, I think even the campaign has this idea that they can convince some of those more white moderate voters to vote for him this year. Do you sense that that's possible in Mississippi? Are those voters in particular ready to cast their vote for someone with that D behind their name instead of the R, as you mentioned?
Well, I have to say, I like to think that it's possible. There's nothing I have, since I'm kind of in the bubble of Oxford.
Sure.
That really, I see lots of SB signs here since I arrived here back in August. I'm between Barnard Observatory and my apartment. That's about it. And what I see is Oxford. I haven't been in my native Covington County, so I don't know kind of what the mood is in the rest of the state. But but judging from my students who are all voting age, a lot of the Mississippians, I think it's possible. As I've said, before, we may not be saved by our virtues, but we may be saved by our demographics. And it may be as our younger voters who are, in my civil rights and literature class this year, I've been teaching this class. This is my 4th year of teaching it. This is the first time outside of when I was teaching it at Millsaps that I've had more than one white student. I have a majority of white students. They're all trying to understand the moment that we're in. There are a lot of people like that out there in Mississippi, young people. I'm not so sure if that's the case with my generation, but that group is growing. And that's the group that I think will be voting for SB, and that could I hope turns things around. But I don't have any real sense. I wish I had a good crystal ball.
Sure. Before we get into some questions, I see the most recent comment here from Diane Feldman. Comment on the Senate race. Don't forget Jimmy Edwards can peel off a few points. He's Libertarian third-party candidate running for Senate. That's true. We've been talking a lot about the possible effect of that. If I personally haven't found a Trump SB voter in Mississippi yet. He's going to need some of those for sure if he has a chance of winning. I think, there could be a lot of Trump Jimmy Edwards voters though, who may not, appreciate some of the things that Cindy Hyde-Smith has said, and that ultimately could help SB. We'll see how that shakes out, but that's a great comment, Diane, and we'll be covering that some in the next 2 weeks too at Mississippi Today. Okay, Ralph, here's a first question. This is more of a prompt from Susan Cushman. In your book, Ever is a Long Time, my favorite line is this, quote, "Only then could I bring my two views of Mississippi together, the terror and the magnificence." As a native of Mississippi, and I've often felt that way too, please say more about this.
I think that terror really comes from our past and our violent past. I think what I was writing about there specifically are my memories of that from from my childhood. But that magnificence is what I've been writing about, the past 2 years, and that's this landscape that's inspired so many writers. And this is a beautiful state, and I've had the great privilege, before the pandemic, to travel all around it. I've been in all 82 counties, and it's beautiful. So I think, as one of the reasons I think that I can really love Mississippi, in spite of all of its issues and complexities, is the physical beauty of the place. That's a part of who I am. As I tell my wife all the time, I said, you married a Mississippian. I can't get the mud of that state off my shoes. It's part of who I am, both the good and the bad, and it's made me who I am.
Hmm. I love this next question for you in particular, Ralph, because again, you were you were kind enough to share your new book coming out early next year with me, and I don't know if there's anyone who could speak more authoritatively on this than you at this point, but if you could make one text required reading in Mississippi, parentheses America, before Election Day, what would it be? Or I'd love to hear your thoughts on the political power and limits of reading right now.
Oh, if I could make one text of everybody should read right now. Actually, I have to say what I've just read that's gotten me to read a ton of Baldwin. I've been on like a complete Baldwin phase. I'm just teaching the fire next time, but it's Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again. If I could get people to read that right now, because what that book does is it sends you off to read all these other things as well. So if there was something in the next 2 weeks that I could get people to read, that would be it. So I hope that answers the question. I mean, I'd love to get people to read Richard Wright,
Sure.
to read Black Boy, especially, because I think that really, that had a great impact on my students this semester. And it's the first time that I've seen how powerful that memoir is.
Here's another question from Diane Feldman again. Mississippians talk about some of their history all the time, particularly 1830 to 1865 in the Archaic period. How do you reconcile the focus on some history with the lack of discussion of the history of enslavement and race?
So how do you
reconcile the focus on some history being, the things that we do talk about, with the lack of discussion of the history of enslavement and race?
Well, I think that period that she's talking about is very much the frontier period. Mississippi as frontier rather than Mississippi as Cotton Kingdom and all the complexities of that. We should be, I think you still can see that through the lens of race, but it's that period where you have to realize that. I teach at the University of Mississippi. It's founded in 1848. This is the land that Indians were removed from. Native people were removed from this land to create this place, and then to enlarge the Cotton Kingdom. All those second sons from North Carolina and Virginia came here to create that. It's a much more complex narrative. That's a very simple. I think that's a simple narrative. And I think that once you get into the Civil War, Reconstruction, it becomes much more complex and layered rather than linear. I think that's really what drives it. Thinking about it like a literature professor. It's like I always say narrative is a layered thing. It's not linear, but we'd like to think of it as linear. I think that's why that other period's talked about more.
Sure. This is an interesting question, and I think maybe you touch on this a little bit in your essay for us today. I've read a couple other of your recent works where you touch on this. When you envision a Mississippi reckoning with its history, what are some of the methods you think would be compelling for Mississippi natives to engage with? What would it look like, and who needs to be leading this effort?
Um, I would say schools. I think you know this would be a great thing for the Mississippi Library Commission to be involved with, to really begin reading groups. I mean, once this pandemic is over and we can gather together again, to do a lot of reading and discussion, which people are doing on Zoom on this platform right now. But yes, I think it's our librarians, our teachers, making this part of our curriculum, that and dealing with the hard questions, not the triumphant narrative of the civil rights movement that Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up, and everything is all good after that. It's really looking at the complexity of it all, and we can do that, and young people are willing to understand that. I think we often like to think we have to make things very simple for young people. These are digital natives we're talking about. They can handle a lot of complexity. They see a lot on these screens that we can't really shelter them from. We should be talking about these things more.
Yeah, I think the notion of implementing some sort of curriculum in Mississippi's schools. I'm 28 years old, and I didn't learn nearly enough about our history, and that's I'm younger. That's not some old bastion of curricula from the old days. So this next question from your friend Dorothy Howarth, I think gets at the heart of that a little bit. Ralph, to what extent would you attribute Cindy Hyde Smith's inability to understand or talk sensitively about race to her education at segregated institutions? And how would you apply that to many white Mississippi voters?
I think Dorothy has really touched on a big issue. I think I don't know if it's Mississippi Today or what percentage of our legislators are graduates of academies, and it's a pretty high percentage. So and I think that's a big part of it. Ellen Ann Fentress's Academies project, I think, goes a long way to getting us to understand that. That's another set of stories that I think that Mississippians should be engaging with. Those stories that Ellen Ann Fentress has been gathering together. But I think she's really touched it. That's it, that world of the Segregation Academy, not just the Segregation Academy, but even the successors to those, which are Christian schools, which would say that, well, we didn't come up during segregation, but looking at this now, we know that so many of the Christian schools really have modeled themselves from those seg academies. They just weren't established between 1970 and 75.
This is another really interesting question for you, Ralph. This is shifting gears for sure, but my friend Pete Joyce in DC, I guess you're still in DC, Pete. Hello. We need to catch up soon. Before Trump's nomination, there were some good faith efforts from Republicans to make inroads with black voters. RNC Chair Ken Melman apologized for the Southern strategy. Paul Ryan started talking about poverty alleviation, etc. That ended abruptly with Trump. Do you see a way for the GOP to make serious inroads with black voters, or will American conservatism always be tied to racism?
I don't see that coming in the next 10 years. I think it will take an entirely new Republican Party for that. I think the Republican Party has tried to recruit a lot of African Americans over the years. I mean, yeah, they've talked about some things, but talk is cheap, and not really seeing any real action on that. Apologizing for the Southern strategy is one thing, but still engaging with that Southern strategy to gain office, to keep things gerrymandered. The Republican Party is, I mean, it's right now, I mean, that racism is so ingrained in the party. It's what Stuart Stevens has been writing about. And I don't see it happening. I think it will take a generation for that. I don't think this is something that's going to happen in 4 years. I don't think it's going to happen in 12 years. But unless the Republican Party starts to think differently about itself, we're never really, it's going to, in the next 10 years, it's going to become a party of the minority, which is going to be white people.
Yeah, I can speak for the Mississippi Republican Party. They have made, I'll say little. I've never seen any effort to appeal to Black voters in the state. It's very segregated by major party in Mississippi.
I've even heard people refer to Black people as Democrats.
Right.
Those Democrats over there. It's like, how do you know they're Democrats? You see that they're Democrats? Like, that's one of the things I was really taken aback by when I first came back to Mississippi, and when I heard that for the first time. And so again, it's there are all these things about race we're not talking about, but how much it is part of our dialogue and the way we look at the world, yet we avoid the topic.
Sure.
And that's a prime example of it.
Ralph, this is just a question from me to you, just curious. What do you make of the Democratic presidential ticket? I don't necessarily, I'm not asking you who you voted for or who you would have rather seen, but what do you make of the ticket and how that might affect turnout in Mississippi?
Well, I think it's great having Kamala Harris on the ticket. I mean, anyone who's kind of read my work knows that I was really not that interested in Joe Biden as a candidate, largely because of his association with segregationists, including Jim Eastland. But I think what Biden has at least revealed, or he's tried to do through choosing Kamala Harris, is to reach out to Black voters. And I think also really to South Asian voters as well, which there's a large population of South Asians in Mississippi. We tend to think of Mississippi in terms of binary, and it's much more diverse than that. So I think it was a very strategic move on Biden's part. Also, someone considerably younger than he is as well. But yes, I wish that we had a younger ticket.
Sure.
I do wish that the Democrats had a younger ticket, but this is what we've got. I think that I'm supporting that ticket. So
sure. Here's I think what will be our last question from Deidre Payne.
Hi, Deidre.
It's a long question. I'll read most of it, I think, here. The first part of it is a question. What will it take for white Mississippians to study the other side of this state's history and learn the whys of segregation and how it has stymied the state's progress? And then, supporting that question, white Mississippians pretty much still hold to Ross Barnett's directive to need to integrate, to keep segregation alive, or to never integrate, rather, to keep segregation alive. On the surface, some of that has changed, but beneath the surface, the state is still holding on to separateness. Leaders claim to be concerned about the talented leaving, but do nothing to keep them here. Other southern states have made changes that benefit the entire population. Mississippi hasn't. So again, the question, what will it take for white Mississippians to study the other side of the state's history, learn the whys of segregation and how it has stymied the state's progress?
Well, I guess I have to go to think about that. I have to really go back to the flag. What really got people thinking about the flag? The protest got people thinking about the flag, but the protest also ended up becoming an economic issue.
Sure.
And I think what we have to do in Mississippi is for Mississippi to have a future economically, we have to, we can't continue this idea of who we once were. I mean, I hear so much from our politicians that's straight out of Mississippi, the closed society. We have to get rid of that mindset, and we have to recognize it. And I think that until there's some severe economic impact seen to that, as well as political, and it's gonna take, I think, Black Mississippians and progressive white Mississippians and other groups to bind together at the ballot box to change it. I was listening to a podcast the other day where there was a woman interviewed from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who had never voted. She was in her 20s, and neither had her grandmother, who was in her 70s. We have a lot of that in this state. So there's still this feeling that, and the reason the woman had never registered to vote, she said, I heard it was so difficult. So we still think about these impediments to voting, and we have to, I think what it's going to take is people voting, reducing those impediments to voting, and then there may be change. But I think that's why we have voter suppression in this state, because they know that if more people voted, that a lot of the people that we elect to office wouldn't be there.
Well, Ralph, that's going to wrap it up, I think. Any parting thoughts, any closing words of wisdom from you as we head into this last 2 weeks before Election Day?
Please vote. Please wear a mask. And a mask can be a fashion accessory. So mask up and vote. Great.
Well, Ralph, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. This has been, as always, such a lovely, insightful conversation. And, I appreciate your dedication to, teaching young Mississippians about our past. And certainly, as we think about our future, you're clearly doing important work, and just can't thank you enough for that and for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and I'm proud to be a Mississippian. This is a moment that makes me proud to be a Mississippian. So thank you for that.
Sure. Everyone, I'll do the shameless book plug again. You've got a book coming out. Is it March of next year? I want to get that right.
March 16th is the release date.
Okay. A Place Like Mississippi, A Journey Through a Real and Imagined Literary Landscape. Ralph, really appreciate it. And for everyone else listening, thank you for being here. Like I said at the beginning, hate that we can't do these things in person, but it really is a pleasure just sort of getting to do what we can for now. And I hope everyone's taking care of each other and staying safe. I'll do one more shameless plug here. A week from today, next Tuesday, we're doing our next installment of the Mississippi Writers on Mississippi Politics, or Authors on Mississippi Politics series. I'm going to butcher her last name. I'm going to try my best here. I'm so sorry to Amy Nezu-Kamatil. I think that's close.
It's Duku Matata.
Okay, there you go. She is an incredible poet and essayist based also in Oxford at the University of Mississippi. She just released a new book herself, and our Emerging Reporters Fellow, Brittany Brown, who's actually finishing her second year in the Southern Studies school at the university, is going to be interviewing her. So that's next Tuesday, 11:30 to 12:30. It's going to be an hour earlier than this one has been. But for everyone listening who attended, thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking with you. Ralph, thank you again.